Mrs. Hargrove counted out the coins slowly, the way someone does when they want you to feel every second of it. Then, without a word, she turned her wrist over and let them fall not into Eliza's hand, but onto the ground between them, scattering through the mud and horse dung of Red Hollow's Main Street, while 30 people watched and said absolutely nothing. That moment, the sound of those coins hitting dirt, the smirk that crossed Clara Hargrove's mouth, was the moment everything in Eliza Rowan's life cracked open. Not broke, cracked open, like a seed that's been pressed into hard ground long enough that it finally splits just to survive. If it were you standing there, hands already calloused from 16-hour days, stomach half empty, wearing your dead mother's mended dress, what would you have done? If you've ever been humiliated in front of a crowd by someone who knew they could get away with it, then you already know exactly how cold the air felt on Eliza's face in that moment. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's story all the way through, because what happens next is the kind of thing most people never see coming, and I don't want you to miss a single moment of it. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1882 arrived in Red Hollow, Montana Territory, the way most things arrived in that town: loud, uninvited, and carrying heat that hadn't been asked for. The Founders Festival was the single largest event of the year, and for 3 days the main street transformed into something that almost looked like prosperity. Vendors set up stalls selling smoked meats and ribbon candy. Children ran between adult legs. The town's brass band played from the gazebo with more enthusiasm than talent, and women in their best dresses moved through the crowd with a particular kind of careful attention, checking who was watching, who was standing beside whom, who was walking toward whom. The object of most of that careful attention was a man named Silas Mercer. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than vanity, and he wore his money quietly, no gold watch chain, no embroidered vest. Just clean clothes that fit him well, and a hat that had seen real weather. He'd inherited the Mercer Ranch from his father 6 years earlier, when the old man dropped dead in a pasture without warning. And in those 6 years, Silas had nearly doubled what the ranch was worth through the kind of methodical, stubborn labor that doesn't make for interesting stories, but does make for a surviving business. He wasn't much for festivals. He'd come because his foreman, a stout and relentlessly cheerful man named Dell, had told him flatly that if Silas spent another summer eating dinner alone in his office, Dell would personally drag him into town by the collar. Silas had come to prove that was unnecessary, and had been standing near the fence post at the edge of the street for the better part of an hour, watching the crowd without being part of it. He almost missed what happened entirely. The commotion started near the fabric stall, a small setup at the edge of the festival grounds, where a young woman had laid out samples of her mending work and a handwritten price board. She wasn't a vendor who'd paid for a booth. She'd simply arrived early with a folding table and set herself up in the gap between two proper stalls, the way people do when they haven't got money for the official space but do have enough nerve to show up anyway. Eliza Rowan was 27, and she had been a seamstress in Red Hollow for 3 years. She hadn't chosen this town so much as run out of road here. She'd come from a place called Harlan's Creek, 2 counties east, where her family's farm had been lost when she was 19. And she'd been moving forward in roughly a straight line ever since, taking in mending work wherever she stopped long enough to find it. She was not beautiful in the way the town talked about beauty, not pink-cheeked and soft-spoken and careful with her opinions. Her hands were permanently ink-stained at the fingertips from the marking thread she used to measure hems. Her hair was the color of dark river water, always escaping whatever she'd tried to pin it into. She had a direct way of looking at people that some found unsettling and others found rude. Though it was neither, it was just the look of someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to take up space. She'd been doing reasonable business for most of the morning. A woman needed buttons replaced on a winter coat. A man wanted a tear in his jacket sleeve repaired before his wife saw it. Small jobs, quick work, coins that added up slowly. She'd kept her price board honest. Nothing inflated for the festival crowd, nothing discounted either. Clara Hargrove arrived at the stall sometime after 11. Clara was the wife of Gerald Hargrove, who owned the largest dry goods store in Red Hollow and 3 others in neighboring towns. She wore a dress that cost more than most families in Red Hollow, spent on food in 2 months, and she wore it with the particular confidence of a woman who has confused being wealthy with being right. She set 2 blouses on Eliza's table without greeting her. Both need the collars reset. The stitching is coming apart. Eliza examined them. She named her price fair work, fair rate. Clara's eyebrows moved. I'll give you half that. Then you'll want to take them to someone else, Eliza said, not unkindly. It was the wrong thing to say, or rather, it was the right thing to say in a world that didn't yet exist. In the world that did exist, in Red Hollow in the summer of 1882, a woman with no family name and no property, and no one standing behind her, did not tell Clara Hargrove to take her business elsewhere. Not in public. Not during the Founders' Festival, when half the town was watching. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened her coin purse, counted out exactly what she'd originally offered, and dropped the coins deliberately, one by one, not into Eliza's outstretched hand but past it, onto the ground. Several fell into a muddy rut left by a wagon wheel. A few more scattered under the edge of the table. One rolled and stopped against a horse, dropping 3 feet away. There, Clara said. That's what your work is worth. The crowd that had gathered, and there was a crowd, because there is always a crowd. For this kind of thing went perfectly still. 30 people, maybe more. Some looked away. Some didn't. Eliza stood with her hands still out, fingers curved where she'd expected the coins to land. The embarrassment was physical. She could feel it in her face, in her chest, in the specific horror of being made small in front of people who would remember it. She could have argued. She could have demanded the coins back in her hand where they belonged. She could have made a scene that would have felt satisfying for approximately 4 seconds before making everything worse for the next year. Instead, she crouched down. Slowly, without rushing, she collected every coin. She fished the ones from the muddy rut out with her fingers. She picked up the one near the horse, dropping without comment. She stood back up, wiped her hands on the side of her apron, and set the coins in the cigar box she used as a till. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She simply looked at Clara Hargrove the way you look at weather, something inconvenient and temporary that you've decided not to be destroyed by. Clara left. The crowd dispersed. The brass band started up again from the gazebo. Silas Mercer, standing 40 feet away with one hand resting on a fence post, had watched all of it. He had seen plenty of women humiliated in his 34 years. He'd seen them cry or argue or smile through it with a terrible fixed brightness that was worse than either. He had not seen one simply absorb the humiliation and refuse to be made smaller by it. There was no performance in what Eliza did. She hadn't been brave for an audience. She'd just handled it, the way you handle hard weather, and then gone back to her work. He stood there for another full minute before he moved. By the time he walked to her stall, she was already taking apart the seam on someone else's garment, her fingers moving with an automatic efficiency. She didn't look up when he stopped in front of her table. I have a shirt, he said. The cuff button keeps pulling loose, the fabric around it's fraying. She looked up then, briefly assessing the way she looked at everyone, taking in what she needed and not lingering. Leave it with me. I can have it by end of day tomorrow. I don't know your name, he said. Eliza Rowan. She went back to the seam she was working on. And yours, he told her. Something crossed her face, not impressed exactly, but aware. The way you look when you recognize a name that carries weight in a place. Silas Mercer, she repeated. I fixed 2 of your ranch hands' jackets this spring. I know, he said. They both told me the work held better than what they'd had done in Billings. She glanced up again, slightly longer this time, as if reassessing whether the compliment was real or performed. She must have decided it was real, because she gave a single small nod. Leave the shirt, he did. He also came back the next morning before she'd expected him. The shirt was ready. She'd stayed up a half hour past her usual time to make sure of that. And when she handed it back to him and he examined the cuff she'd repaired, he turned it over twice the way a man does when he's actually looking, not just pretending to. What do I owe you? She told him. He paid it without trying to negotiate, which told her something. A man with Silas Mercer's money could have easily halved her rate, and she'd have had no real recourse. Everyone in town would have told her to be grateful she got anything. He didn't. He counted out exact payment, dropped it into her hand the way it was supposed to be done, and then stood there a moment without leaving. The woman yesterday, he said. Clara Hargrove. Eliza's jaw tightened slightly. Yes, does she do that often? Often. Enough. She began folding the square of cloth she'd used to wrap the shirt for him. And you've never said anything? She stopped folding. Looked at him with the directness that unnerved people. What would I say? She's Gerald Hargrove's wife. He owns half the supply contracts that keep this town running, including the feed store your ranch hands use. I say something. I become the seamstress with the attitude problem, and the 3 other families who might hire me start reconsidering. She picked up the folding again. I'm not stupid, Mr. Mercer. I just can't afford to be proud. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a distinction most people don't make. Most people haven't had to. She tied the string around the wrapped shirt and handed it to him. He took it, started to turn away, then stopped. My cook is leaving at the end of the month, he said. She's going to her daughter's place in Oregon. The ranch will need new curtains. For the main house, the current ones are past saving. I'll need them measured and made up, not purchased from a catalog. Would you be interested in the work? It was enough money, she could see, that immediately from the scope of it, that turning it down would be difficult to justify. It was also very clearly more than a business offer. Not in a threatening way. In the way of someone who was trying to find a legitimate excuse to see her again without making her feel pressured. She recognized it because she wasn't naive. She also recognized that this was the part where most stories ended badly for women like her. I'd need to see the measurements before I could quote a price, she said finally. Of course. And the work is just the curtains. His expression didn't change, but something in it settled as if she'd said the right thing, and he'd been waiting to hear it. Just the curtains, he agreed. She nodded once. They set a time. He walked back toward the festival, and Eliza watched him go for exactly the length of time it took her to talk herself out of whatever she was starting to feel, and then went back to her work. The curtains took 4 visits to complete. By the second visit, they had stopped talking only about curtains. It started the way most real conversations start sideways. She came to measure a window in the front room, and he was sitting at his desk with a ledger open, and she asked without thinking whether the column he was frowning at was a supplier problem or a land tax problem, because the frown looked more like numbers than weather. He looked up, surprised, and then told her. It was a supplier problem, a feed vendor who'd been shaving weight off deliveries and charging full price, something his foreman hadn't caught because the vendor was his foreman's brother-in-law. Eliza said, almost without meaning to, have you checked the delivery logs against the billing invoices over the last 6 months? Not just the current quarter. He had not. She told him the approach she'd used when she had briefly worked in a supply house in her early 20s, before the sewing work had steadied. It was nothing complicated, just methodical cross-checking, the kind of thing that takes patience more than skill. He spent the next 20 minutes asking her questions. Not performative questions. Real ones. The kind where he actually waited for her answer before forming his next thought. By the 4th visit, she had stopped feeling like she was waiting for the moment this would go wrong. That was when she started actually worrying. Because she had always known, in the way a woman who's had to be smart about such things, just knows that men like Silas Mercer didn't stay available. They got managed. By families with matching fortunes. By mothers who had promised things over dinner in rooms she'd never be invited into. By arrangements made years before either party was old enough to have opinions about them. She had trusted exactly twice in her life. Once with a boy from Harlan's Creek who'd turned out to be the kind of man who disappears when things get difficult. Once with the law, which had not recovered her father's farm and had not made the man who cheated him answer for it. She wasn't in the habit of a third try. So she finished the curtains. She delivered them. She collected her payment full rate, no negotiation, delivered into her hand. She thanked him for the work. And she started the walk back to her sewing shop, telling herself this was the end of it. Clean and simple, and it was better this way. She made it almost to the end of the drive before she heard the screen door of the ranch house bang open behind her. She didn't turn around. She kept walking. His boots on the packed dirt were deliberate, not chasing, just closing the distance, at the pace of someone who had something to say and intended to say it. Eliza. She stopped, not because of the name, because of the way he said it, not like a command, not like a question, like an acknowledgement, like he was confirming something to himself as much as calling to her. She turned. He was standing in the afternoon light, holding the screen door open behind him as if he'd stopped himself mid-step. He looked like a man who had thought about what he wanted to say and then lost it the moment he needed it. "You left your measuring tape," he finally said. She looked at his empty hands. He looked at them too, then looked back at her, and the corner of his mouth shifted not quite a smile, something more honest than that. The expression of a man who has just done something slightly stupid and knows it. "I didn't leave my measuring tape," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." The afternoon held them both there for a moment that neither of them had planned on and neither quite knew what to do with. A hawk moved over the ridge to the north. Somewhere in the distance, a horse made a sound of protest about something. "I'll let you know," Eliza said carefully, "if I have other work that might suit the ranch." "That would be fine," he said. She nodded once, walked the rest of the way to the road, did not look back. But she was already calculating not feelings, because that would have been reckless but facts. The curtains were done, the shirt before that, 2 of his ranch hands jackets before that. He paid correctly. He asked real questions. He listened to the answers. None of that was proof of anything. She knew that. She also knew that she was going to sleep badly that night, and the night after, because the thing she'd been trying to end was considerably less ended than she'd been pretending. She had not expected any of it. She had not expected him at all. And that, as it turned out, was the first thing about Silas Mercer that she trusted not because he was wealthy or steady or said the right things, but because he had walked back through a screen door for a measuring tape he didn't have, and then had the grace to know she'd seen right through him, and the honesty to let her. It wasn't much, but Eliza Rowan had built whole futures out of less. The measuring tape stayed on her workbench for 4 days, before Eliza moved it to the drawer where she kept her better tools. She told herself that meant nothing, that she was simply being tidy. On the 5th day, she had a new customer, a school teacher named Mrs. Pruitt, who needed the hem of 3 dresses let down, because her youngest daughter had grown 3 inches since March, and there was no money for new fabric. Eliza charged her half rate without saying so, just announced the number, and Mrs. Pruitt accepted it with the worn gratitude of someone who'd learned not to ask why good things happened, because asking seemed to make them stop. They talked while Eliza worked about the weather, about the school's broken front window that the town council had been promising to fix since February, about how the feed store had raised its prices again, and everyone was feeling it except the people who owned the feed store. Eliza kept her eyes on the hem and let the conversation move where it wanted to go, which was eventually, inevitably, to Silas Mercer. "I heard you did the curtains up at the ranch, Mrs. Pruitt said. "I did. Nice work if you can get it." "It was good work," Eliza said, which was different from what the teacher meant, and she knew it. Mrs. Pruitt had the social awareness to leave it there, but the pause she left it in was full of the things she hadn't said. Eliza finished the hem with more concentration than it required. After the teacher left, the shop was quiet in a way that pressed on things. Eliza swept the floor, which didn't need sweeping yet, and reorganized the thread spools by color, which was something she only did when she was trying not to think about something specific. She was not a woman who fell easily. She knew that about herself the way you know things you've tested under real conditions not. Because someone told you, but because you'd tried it once, and the fall had been long, and the landing had been hard, and you'd gotten up afterward with a clear understanding of what that kind of thing cost. She'd been 19 when her family's farm was taken. 20 when the boy from Harlan's Creek had left without much of an explanation, beyond a letter that was shorter than it should have been. By 21, she'd understood that the world was not organized around her convenience, and that understanding had made her careful in ways that looked like coldness to people who hadn't earned the right to know the difference. Silas Mercer was not a boy from Harlan's Creek. She knew that too. But knowing it and trusting it were 2 separate operations, and she'd only done one of them so far. She put the thread spools back the way they'd been and went to bed early. She did not sleep particularly well. What she didn't know couldn't have known, because no one told her, was that 3 days after she'd walked back down his drive, Silas had sat at that same desk with the ledger open and found that he couldn't make himself concentrate on the column of numbers in front of him. He'd done what she suggested, checked the delivery logs against the billing invoices over the full 6 months, and found the shortage she'd predicted 17 instances of shaved weight, totaling just under $40 worth of stolen product. It was enough to let the vendor go and enough to justify a new arrangement with someone else. He'd taken a certain satisfaction in that. The satisfaction had lasted about half a day, at which point he'd noticed the satisfaction was less about the vendor and more about the fact that she'd been right, and that he'd wanted to tell her she'd been right, and that he had no reasonable occasion to do so. Dell found him in the barn that evening doing unnecessary works on a saddle that didn't need attention. "You rode this morning," Dell said. "That saddle's fine. The back stitching's loose." Dell looked at the saddle. "It's not." Silas kept working on it anyway. Dell leaned against the stall door and watched him with the expression of a man who has known someone long enough to read them without being given information. "The seamstress," Dell said finally. Silas didn't answer. "She did good work on the curtains. Martha said they were the best curtains in the county. Martha has seen 12 curtains in her life. She's seen plenty. She knows good work." Dell picked at a splinter on the stall door. "She also said the woman who made them had the steadiest hand she'd ever watched work." Silas set down the tack he'd been unnecessarily adjusting and looked at his foreman, who was trying and mostly failing to appear casual. "I'm not looking for advice," Silas said. "I'm not giving any. I'm just describing curtains." Silas stood up, put the saddle back where it belonged, and left the barn. Dell watched him go, and then allowed himself a small private smile that he would have denied if anyone had seen it. The thing about Silas Mercer was that he had been managing things alone for a long time. Not unhappily, he was not a man given to self-pity, but alone in the specific way of someone who'd taken on a large responsibility before he'd finished becoming himself, and had organized everything around that responsibility ever since. His father had been a competent man with a bad temper and clear opinions about what constituted weakness, and the ranch had been built on those opinions. And Silas had inherited both the ranch and some of the opinions, though he'd been quietly revising the consent set for years. He found legitimate reasons to go into town twice in the following week. He told himself each time that he wasn't going to her shop. He went past it both times without stopping. The third time, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was threatening weather and he'd come into town for fence wire and grain invoices, he walked past her shop, continued to the end of the block, stood on the corner for what he later estimated was about 90 seconds, and then walked back. The bell above the door announced him. She looked up from the table where she was working, and her expression moved through several things quickly enough that he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying close attention. Something that might have been relief, something that immediately organized itself back into composure. "Mr. Mercer, I found a problem with another supplier," he said. "The approach you described, I used it. I want to try the same method on my water rights documentation, and I don't entirely know what I'm doing." It was not a convincing excuse. He knew it wasn't convincing. She knew it wasn't convincing. The difference was that it was also completely true. He genuinely had been wrestling with the water rights documentation, and he genuinely could have used the perspective. She looked at him for a moment. "Water rights are legal documents. I'm a seamstress." "You spotted a supplier fraud in 60 seconds by looking at 2 columns of numbers," he said. "I'm not asking for legal advice. I'm asking for a second set of eyes." Another pause. "I have a customer at 2. It's barely 10. She put down what she was working on, wiped her hands, and gestured to the chair across from her work table. He sat in it. She pulled the stool around from her side and sat across from him, and he spread the documents on the table between them. They worked for an hour and 40 minutes. She found 2 discrepancies he'd missed, and 1 significant gap in the documentation that related to a dam the railroad had been quietly discussing building upstream, something that, if constructed without the proper easement negotiation, could divert enough water to cripple the summer grazing on the ranch's eastern quarter. He wouldn't have seen it. It was buried in language that looked routine until you understood what was being not said. "How do you know how to read this?" he asked. "My father spent 3 years trying to read a land contract that had already been used to ruin him," she said. "I read it with him. You learn things that way." It was the first time she'd mentioned her father directly. She said it without particular expression. The way people mention old wounds they've learned to navigate around. Not fine, exactly, but not bleeding anymore either. "What happened to the contract?" he asked, because he was trying to learn when to ask and when to leave things alone, and he wasn't always right about which was which. "Nothing," she said. "Nothing happened to it." The man who wrote it into existence is still in Harlan's Creek. My father's still without his farm. The law looked at it and decided it was probably fraudulent, and also that there wasn't enough evidence to prove it, which is a very useful thing to decide if you don't want to make powerful people uncomfortable. She straightened the documents into a neat stack. I learned to read legal language because I wanted to understand how something that felt like theft got to call itself a contract. That's all. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what was your father's name? Jacob Rowan. She said it like it still mattered. He was a good farmer, not a clever man, but a careful one. He never borrowed more than he had reason to believe he could pay back. He read everything he signed twice, except for the one document that was designed specifically to be misread by a man reading carefully. She stood up and moved her stool back around to her side of the table, which is the most sophisticated kind of theft there is, because the victim looks stupid, even to people who would otherwise sympathize. Silas folded his own documents and put them in his coat. I'll have someone look at the railroad easement situation. With the gap you found, there might be something to do about it. There might. She picked up her work again. Send me the invoice for the curtain fabric you fronted. I haven't gotten it yet. I covered the fabric. It was a ranch expense. She looked up. We didn't agree to that. We also didn't agree to you finding a water rights problem that might save the Eastern Quarter. He stood. Fabric was $8. Call it even. She looked at him with that direct, assessing look. He'd started to understand that the look wasn't hostility. It was the expression of someone who'd been managing on her own for a long time and had learned to calculate every transaction carefully because miscalculation had consequences she was the only one who paid for. Fine, she said finally. Even. He left, and this time she didn't watch him go. She went straight back to work, but her hands moved slightly faster than necessary, which was the only tell she allowed herself. That was how it went for the next 3 weeks. He found reasons. She permitted them. The reasons got thinner, a question about thread count for a saddle repair that he absolutely could have asked anyone else, a book on land surveying he thought she might find useful, which was either thoughtful or presumptuous, depending on how you looked at it. And she spent 2 days looking at it from both angles before she started reading it. They talked more than the reasons required, which was the whole point, and which they both pretended not to notice. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about someone who doesn't hand information over easily. His mother had died when he was 11. He'd had a younger sister who'd gone to live with an aunt in St. Louis at 16 and had married a man there who was, by Silas's account, decent enough, but the kind of decent that didn't inspire strong feelings either direction. He had read more than his education technically required because his father's library had been available, and his education hadn't been, and books had filled the gap in the way that books sometimes do, for children who are mostly on their own. He was capable of warmth, but had to remember to show it, which made the times he forgot himself, and showed it anyway more useful than the times he was trying. He was not, she was slowly concluding, the sort of man she'd been preparing to protect herself from, which created a new problem, because her defenses were calibrated for a specific threat, and a different kind of man left her without a clear strategy. She was chewing on that problem on a Friday afternoon in late August when Dell arrived at her shop. She recognized him. She'd met him briefly twice at the ranch, and his expression when he came through the door was the particular expression of a man who has been sent to do something he finds uncomfortable and has decided the best approach is to do it quickly. Miss Rowan, he said, I'm sorry to bother you. I thought you should hear this before the rest of the town does, because the rest of the town is going to hear it by sundown. She set down her scissors. Hear what? Dell turned his hat in his hands. A family came in on this morning's stage. Name of Harrow. Father, mother, daughter. Beatrice Harrow. They're staying at the hotel. The name meant nothing to her yet. She waited. The Harrows are out of Billings, Dell continued, clearly hating every word of this. Old family. Old money. And about 12 years back when Silas was 22 and his father was still running things, there was an understanding. Between the families. Nothing written, nothing legal. But the kind of understanding that functions like an agreement because both parties treated it as one. He stopped turning his hat. Silas's father promised him to Beatrice Harrow, informally, at a dinner. Silas was there, but he was 22 and his father was still his father, and he didn't argue. The air in the shop was suddenly a different temperature. He never followed through on it, Dell said quickly. Never wrote to the family formally, never visited, never anything. But he also never formally rejected it, because doing that meant a direct confrontation with his father, and that wasn't something he was prepared to do while the old man was alive. And after the old man died, there was always something else to manage, and it kept getting pushed back, and then long enough went by that he thought maybe the Harrows had understood it wasn't happening. They didn't understand that, Eliza said. Apparently not. Dell looked genuinely miserable. They've come to formalize it. The father's got letters from Silas's father. Not a contract, nothing legally binding, but in front of the whole town, it's going to look like an obligation. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because Silas doesn't know I'm here. He met her eyes. And because I've worked for that man for 8 years, and I've never seen him move toward anything the way he's been moving toward you. And I thought you deserved to have the information before it landed on you sideways. She looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Dell nodded, put his hat back on, and left. Eliza sat still for probably 2 minutes. Then she stood up, closed the shop an hour early, walked back to her room above the laundry, and sat on the edge of the bed in the way you sit when something has just arranged itself into exactly the shape you'd always suspected it would. She had been right. Not about him specifically, but about the category, about how these things worked. A man from a family like his didn't just get to choose. There were structures. There were promises made by dead men that the living were expected to honor because the alternative was causing a scene. And she was what? A seamstress who'd gotten comfortable, who'd let 3 weeks of good conversations convince her that the rules of the world she actually lived in had been suspended for her specifically. She was angry at herself more than at the situation. Anger at a situation was useless. Anger at your own choices was at least instructional. She put on her coat because the evening had gotten cold and went out for a walk that didn't have a destination. She was on her second loop around the far block when she heard her name again, and this time it wasn't Dell. Silas was standing at the corner of Maple and 2nd, looking like he'd been walking fast until very recently. He was alone. No horse, he'd come on foot from somewhere, which meant he'd been looking for her on foot, which meant he'd been looking for a while. You know, she said. Not a question. Dell told me he'd come to see you. Right after he told me I was an idiot for not handling this years ago, which he wasn't wrong. He was slightly out of breath. I should have ended it formally when my father died. I kept telling myself it was already understood. I was wrong about that. Yes, she said. You were. He didn't flinch from it. I know. A whole family has traveled from Billings, she said, based on the assumption that you're available to be married to their daughter. A family with letters from your father. And you want me to hear what, exactly? I want you to hear that it's already done, he said. I went to the hotel this afternoon. I sat with Martin Harrow, and I told him that I respected his daughter, that I was sorry my father had made a promise I wasn't prepared to keep, and that I was not going to honor it. I told him I'd cover the cost of their travel and stay as a gesture of respect for the inconvenience, and that I hoped the misunderstanding could end without bad blood. Eliza stared at him. You went this afternoon, before I came to find you. Yes. How did that go? Something crossed his face. Poorly, in the immediate sense. Martin Harrow is not a gracious man when his plans are disrupted. There were some things said that won't be unsaid. The whole town will know about it by morning, and the version they hear from the Harrows will not be flattering to me. Eliza thought about that. And Beatrice? The daughter? He hesitated in a way that told her the answer was complicated. Beatrice Harrow is I don't know if she wanted this. I don't know if this was her choice or her father's plan that she'd organized her expectations around. She didn't say much. She sat very straight and looked like a person waiting for a verdict, and I felt genuinely terrible about all of it. He paused. That doesn't change anything, but it doesn't feel clean either. That strangely was the thing that got to her. Not the declaration, not the speech about what he'd done. The fact that he said it didn't feel clean, that he'd let it be complicated out loud, instead of wrapping it in the kind of righteousness that would have made him feel better and told her less. She looked at him standing there in the evening cold, looking like a man who had done a difficult thing and was not asking for credit for it, and also would not particularly mind if she acknowledged that it had cost him something. You should have settled this years ago, she said. I know, And I'm not something you chose instead of her. I'm not the reason you ended it. No, he agreed. I ended it because it was the right thing to do, and because I'd waited too long already. You're the reason I stopped pretending I had more time. He looked at her steadily. Those are different things. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the town moved in its evening rhythms, a wagon going past, lamplight coming on in windows, the distant sound of the hotel's front door. The town is going to talk, she said. The town already talks. About me specifically. The seamstress who turned his head. They'll have opinions. They already have opinions, he said. And I've noticed that worrying about their opinions hasn't made your life appreciably better. She almost smiled. That's blunt. I've been around you long enough to think you prefer it. I do, she admitted. That doesn't mean it's comfortable. He took a half step closer, which was not dramatic, just a reduction of the distance between them that acknowledged the conversation had moved somewhere real. I'm not asking you for anything right now, he said. I'm not asking you to feel anything in particular about what I did this afternoon or why. I just wanted you to know what happened before someone else told you a version of it. She looked at him. She thought about the measuring tape he hadn't had. She thought about Dell arriving at her shop with his hat in his hands because he'd cared enough to warn her. She thought about the water rights document and the thread count question that was never really about thread, and the way he listened when she spoke, actually listened. Not the performed listening of someone waiting for their turn. She thought about her father's farm and the fraudulent contract and the law that had decided inconvenience for the powerful was more troubling than injustice for the powerless. She thought about how tired she was of being careful about everything, all the time, alone. You should expect, she said carefully, that I'm going to be difficult about this. Not as a game. Because I am actually difficult. I know. I have opinions about things, and I don't change them to make people comfortable. I know that too. And if there's ever a point where you're finding me inconvenient and deciding to manage me instead of talk to me, that's the end of it. I've been managed before. I didn't enjoy it. He met her eyes. I would never be that quiet about something that bothered me. I'd tell you directly. Good, she said. I'd rather argue than be handled. Then we'll probably argue. Probably, she agreed. They stood there for a moment, which should have been awkward and wasn't. The lamplight from the nearest window reached just far enough to catch the edge of his face and the edge of hers. There's a hardware order I need to go back through, she said finally. I found a discrepancy in a delivery invoice this week, not mine. A woman I know who runs the alteration shop in Callaway. She asked me to look at it. Turns out the delivery company has been doing the same thing your feed vendor was doing. He blinked, following the shift. How bad? Bad enough. She's out about $60 over the last year. Does she have the original order forms? Most of them. Not all. Bring me what she has, he said. I know someone at the county assayer's office who dealt with something similar. He might know what her options are. Eliza nodded. I'll bring them Thursday. Thursday, he agreed. Turned and walked back toward her room, and this time he stayed where he was and watched her go, and she knew he was watching, and neither of them said anything further about it, because the thing had been said, and they were both the kind of people who didn't need to say it twice. The Harrows left Red Hollow 3 days later. Martin Harrow made sure, before he left, to have a long conversation with Gerald Hargrove at the dry goods counter, and he made sure that conversation covered his version of events in the kind of detail that would outlast his departure. By the time the stage pulled out, there were at least 24 people in Red Hollow who had heard that Silas Mercer had disgraced a good family over a seamstress with no name and no property, and that no decent family in Billings would trust him again. Clara Hargrove repeated this in 4 separate conversations within 24 hours. Eliza heard about it on a Wednesday morning from Mrs. Pruitt, who told her with the compressed energy of someone who's been sitting on information and cannot sit on it any longer. The schoolteacher's face was full of the expectant sympathy of a person who assumes they're delivering news that will wound. Eliza thanked her, went back to the hem she was working on, and said nothing more about it. What she felt was something more complicated than the clean anger she'd have preferred. She felt the familiar cold of being talked about, the specific exposure of having your life handled by other people's mouths. She felt a defensive spike of pride because she was the woman the stories were about, and the stories had her wrong. And underneath both of those things, she felt something she didn't quite have a name, for something that had to do with the fact that Silas had taken the consequence she'd predicted and gone ahead with the thing anyway. And that consequence was now real and sitting in the middle of the town and pointing at her. She hadn't asked him to do it. She hadn't asked for any of it. That was the part she kept coming back to, pressing at it the way you press a bruise to understand its edges. She hadn't asked. He'd decided. And now there was a cost that was partly hers to carry, even though she hadn't made the decision. And the carrying of it was going to be a daily thing in a town this size, and she couldn't decide whether what she felt about that was gratitude or resentment, or something that was both at the same time. On Thursday, she arrived at the ranch with the invoice files for her friend in Callaway. Silas' contact turned out to be useful. He'd dealt with 3 identical schemes in the last 2 years and knew exactly which county documents could be used to reconstruct missing order records. The friend would have a case, not a guaranteed one, but a case. While Silas was writing down the contact information, Eliza said without preamble, "Clara Hargrove is telling everyone, I'm the reason the Harrow girl was embarrassed." He didn't look up from writing. "I know. It's affecting my business. 2 women who came in regularly haven't come back this week." He did look up then. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. I'm not telling you that so you'll apologize. I'm telling you because it's real, and I think you should know it's real. And I think I'm still deciding how I feel about being in the middle of a story I didn't entirely write." He was quiet for a moment. "That's fair. I know it's fair. I'm telling you because I need to say it, not because I need you to fix it." He set the pen down. "Do you want me to say something to Clara Hargrove?" "No. Saying something to Clara Hargrove will only make it a bigger story. What I need is for the business to hold until people get interested in something else." She picked up the files she'd brought. "And I need you to understand that I make my own choices about what I can carry and what I can't. You don't get to make those calculations for me." "I understand that," he said. "Good." She stood. "The contact information for my friend in Callaway she'll write to him? Tell her to use my name when she does. It'll get a faster response." She noted that. She also noted that he'd offered it without framing it as a favor, just information, deployed because it was useful. She was learning to read the difference. She walked home that evening through the long autumn light, with the kind of tiredness into her that wasn't physical, the tiredness of carrying complexity without a place to put it down. The town still had its opinions. Clara Hargrove still had her mouth. 2 customers had stopped coming, and she was going to feel those 2 customers in the margins for the next 2 months. Silas Mercer was still the man who'd walked back through a screen door for a measuring tape he didn't have, and who'd gone to a hotel room on a Tuesday afternoon and ended something that had cost him, and who'd handed her a contact name without dressing it as charity. She had not figured out yet what to do with all of that. She suspected the figuring out was going to take longer than she'd like, and that it was going to be inconvenient, and that it was going to require her to revise some of the systems she'd built to protect herself. She had survived a lot of revisions. She would survive this one too. But she went home that night with one hand in her coat pocket and the other swinging free, and she was thinking about Thursday. Not the Thursday that had just happened, but the next one, and whether there would be a reason to go back, and what kind of reason it would have to be. She already knew the answer. She just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. The next Thursday came without a manufactured reason, and Eliza went anyway. She told herself it was because she wanted to follow up on the Callaway invoice situation, which was partially true. The friend had written to the county contact using Silas's name, and there had already been a preliminary response that was more encouraging than expected. That was real. That was a legitimate update worth delivering in person. She also told herself that she was not the kind of woman who invented pretexts, and that if she was going to show up at a man's ranch on a Thursday morning with nothing specific in her hands, she was going to do it plainly and not dress it as something it wasn't. She arrived at 9. Dell was in the yard moving fence posts and gave her a nod that contained a full paragraph of satisfaction, which she chose not to acknowledge. The screen door was already open. Silas was in the front room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a stack of papers he wasn't really reading. He looked up when she came in, and the thing that crossed his face was simple and immediate, and not at all performed just relief, the plain, undecorated kind, the expression of someone who had been waiting without admitting they were waiting. "The Callaway situation," she said, sitting down across from him. "There's been a response." "Good," he said. Tell me, she told him. He listened the way he always listened, which was completely, without the fidgeting of someone counting down to their turn to speak. The response from the county contact had outlined two possible approaches, one faster and less certain, one slower and more likely to produce a real result. Eliza had already drafted a letter recommending the second approach, which she handed across the table. He read it. "This is well argued," he said. "It's a straightforward case once the records are reconstructed." He set the letter down. "How's your week been?" The shift was so natural she almost missed it from business to the thing underneath business, the question he was actually asking, which was whether the two missing customers had come back, and whether Clara Hargrove had said anything further, and whether she was managing. "Fine," she said, which was her default. And then because she'd told him, she preferred directness, and it would be hypocritical not to practice it. One of them came back. The other sent her daughter instead, which is either a peace offering or a way of getting alterations done, without being seen to associate with me. Which do you think it is? Peace offering. The daughter was friendlier than she needed to be. He nodded. And Clara hasn't been in. Clara won't be in. That's fine. Clara's money wasn't worth the commentary that came with it. She looked at him evenly. I've lost harder customers. Something moved in his expression, not pity, because she would have felt that something closer to respect, the particular kind that comes from watching someone carry weight without theater. The ranch account is going to need new work shirts for 4 of the hands before winter. Heavy fabric, double-seamed. Dell's been putting it off. Send them in. I'll have measurements taken and give you a price before I start. Fair enough. They sat for a moment in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have discovered that they can be quiet together without it being uncomfortable. Outside, Dell was still moving fence posts with a rhythmic determination that was doing a reasonable impression of not listening. "I want to ask you something," Silas said, "and I want you to tell me if it's not a question I've earned the right to ask." She looked at him steadily. "Ask at your father's land. The fraudulent contract. Have you ever looked into what documentation might still exist? The kind that could correct the record, even if the farm itself can't be recovered." The question landed differently than she expected. Not as an intrusion, as evidence that he'd been carrying the information she'd given him, and had been thinking about it in the meantime, which was either touching or presumptuous, and she spent a moment deciding which. "I've thought about it," she said. And thinking about it and doing something about it are different things. I don't know where the original documents are. The lawyer who drafted the contract has been dead for years. His files could be anywhere in another county. Burned, lost. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. My father is 61 years old. He's been living in a 2-room house in Harlan's Creek for 8 years. He has made a kind of peace with what happened, the way people make peace with things they can't change. If I went back and started pulling at it, and nothing came of it, I'd be reopening something for him that he's spent years closing. And if something came of it, she was quiet. His name could be corrected in the county record, Silas said carefully. Not the land, I understand, that's gone, but the official account of why it was lost. Right now, what? Right now the record says he defaulted, which implies he was foolish or dishonest, neither of which is true. That matters. I know it matters. There was an edge in her voice now, not directed at him, just the edge of something that had been pressed on too many times. I've known it mattered since I was 19 years old and watched my father sign paperwork, surrendering property he'd worked 20 years to build, because the alternative was a lawsuit he couldn't afford. I know it matters. Knowing it hasn't made it anything other than a closed door. Silas set his cold coffee down. I have a contact in Helena, a land records attorney. He's handled 3 fraud recovery cases in the last 4 years, not recovery of the property, but correction of the official record. It's a specific legal instrument, and it exists. She looked at him. You looked into this. After you mentioned your father. Yes. You looked into it before you asked me. I wanted to know if there was a door before I pointed at the wall. She sat with that for a moment. The fact of it that he'd taken what she'd told him in a passing, half-guarded sentence, and had gone away and investigated it quietly. Not as a performance of caring, but as a practical act, settled into her chest in a way that was harder to manage than anger would have been. What would it require? She asked finally. The original land records would help, but they're not always essential. The attorney can sometimes reconstruct from county files and witness statements. Do you know anyone still in Harlan's Creek who was there at the time? Anyone who saw the original transaction? There was a clerk at the county office. Henry Marsh. He was the one who notarized the documents. My father said afterward that Marsh had looked uncomfortable the whole time, like a man who knew something was wrong and had decided not to be the person who said so. She paused. I don't know if he's still there. That's somewhere to start. Silas. She said his name the way she rarely did plainly, without anything around it. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer immediately, which she appreciated. A fast answer would have been a prepared one. Because the thing that was done to your father was wrong, he said finally. And because I have resources you don't, and using them for this seems like the obvious thing to do. And I don't know how to explain that any more than that without it, sounding like I'm trying to make you feel a particular way about me. She held his gaze. It does make me feel a particular way about you. I know. I'm trying not to make it sound like a strategy. It doesn't sound like a strategy. Good. She stood up. She needed to stand up, because the conversation had gotten to a place where sitting still was no longer working. She went to the window and looked out at the yard where Dell was now pretending to need something from the water trough, with the absolute conviction of a man with no ulterior motives. I'll write to Henry Marsh, she said, if he's still in Harlan's Creek, if he'll talk. Whatever comes of it, I'll connect you with the attorney. Turn back. This isn't something you do for me. If there's progress to be made, I'll pursue it. I don't need a proxy. I know, he said. I'll make the introduction. Everything after that is yours. She nodded once. Something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to be foolish enough to name it directly. The following 6 weeks moved differently than the weeks before them. There were no pretexts now, or rather, the pretexts had been quietly retired in favor of something more honest. Eliza came to the ranch on Thursdays, with work that was real the shirts for the 4 ranch hands which she measured and delivered over 2 visits, the invoice cross-referencing that had become a genuinely shared project, as Silas found more suppliers with discrepancies. A leather binding repair on a set of his father's ledgers that she'd offered to do, because she'd happened to have the materials and the skill, and he'd accepted without making a thing of it. She also let herself, in careful increments, be something other than professional when she was there. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like anything from the outside. It looked like 2 people having a conversation that ran longer than its stated purpose required. Sitting across from each other, in a room with afternoon light coming through the new curtains she'd made, talking about things that were sometimes practical and sometimes not. He told her about the Eastern Quarter's grazing problem. They'd filed the easement challenge against the railroad, and it was moving slowly through the county process, the way everything moved slowly through the county process. She told him about a new customer who'd come in from one of the outlying homestead claims, a woman named Agnes Park, who had 7 children and a husband who'd broken his leg in September and was going to be off the fields until spring, and who needed a winter coat relined for the oldest daughter and had offered to pay in dried beans and smoked pork because that was what she had. What did you say? Silas asked. I said that was fine. The relining cost me about 40 cents in materials. I've got more beans than I needed anyway. He looked at her. How often do you do that? Do what? Take payment in things that aren't money. She considered being evasive, decided against it. Often enough. The people who pay me in goods are usually the people who need the work most. And I need the work, not just the money, the work itself. I go a little strange when I'm not doing something with my hands. What does strange look like for you? She thought about it seriously, which was how she thought about most things. I start reorganizing the thread spools by color, and then by weight. And then I find myself reading land documents for amusement, which is when I know things have gotten bad. He laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that came out before he'd decided to perform it. She found herself smiling before she'd decided to do that either. It was a small moment. She thought about it for 2 days afterward. The letter she'd sent to Henry Marsh in Harlan's Creek came back 3 weeks later. She recognized the handwriting immediately. She'd seen it on notarized documents when she was 19, the careful clerical print of a man who'd made precision a habit. The letter was short, careful, and frightened in the way of someone who had been frightened of a specific thing for a long time and had mostly gotten used to it. He confirmed he remembered the transaction. He confirmed he had been uncomfortable. He wrote, in the careful language of a man who had been choosing his words about this for 8 years, that there had been elements of the document's preparation that he had not understood at the time, and that had seemed, in retrospect, to depart from standard practice in ways he could not fully account for. It was not a confession. It was the closest thing to one that a frightened old clerk in a small town could put in a letter to a stranger. Eliza read it 3 times. Then she put it in the drawer with her better tools, between the measuring tape and the small leather case that held her finest needles. She brought it to Silas on the next Thursday. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he looked up at her, and his expression was careful, not triumphant, because this wasn't his triumph to have. Just careful and present and attentive. It's not enough on its own, she said, but it's a start. I'll contact the attorney in Helena today, he said. Will you come with me when we go? She stopped. To Helena? The attorney will need to speak with you directly. Your account of what your father told you. Your memory of the documents you read with him. That kind of testimony can support a record correction, even without a witness who'll go on the record formally. He paused. It's a 2-day ride. She held his gaze. They were both aware of what he was asking. In a world where a 2-day ride together meant something specific about the nature of a relationship, and where that something specific would not stay private in a town the size of Red Hollow. When, she said, whenever you're ready, I'll need to arrange coverage for the shop. Mrs. Pruitt, he said, because she'd mentioned once in passing that the school teacher sometimes watched the shop when Eliza needed to be elsewhere, and he had filed that information the way he filed everything. Yes, she said. Mrs. Pruitt left for Helena on the 2nd week of October, with Dell riding alongside as a third party whose presence converted the trip from a scandal into a business matter, at least nominally. Dell understood this role completely and performed it without comment, which was one of the things that made him invaluable. The attorney's name was Warren Gatch. He was 60, compact, wore half spectacles that he took on and off with the frequency of a man who can't decide what he needs to see clearly, and he had the manner of someone who had heard a great many sad stories and had trained himself to respond to them usefully rather than emotionally. He listened to Eliza for 40 minutes without interrupting. She told him everything: the farm, the contract, the way it had been constructed, the elements her father had shown her that had seemed standard until she'd learned enough to understand why they weren't. The clerk, Marsh, the letter. When she finished, Gatch took off his spectacles, put them back on, and said, "The record correction is possible. I want to be clear about what that means. It means an amendment to the county land records in Harlan's Creek that documents the formal finding that the 1,871 transfer of the Rowan farm was achieved through fraudulent contract construction. It does not restore the property. It does not create a legal claim against the man who held the contract. It does, and I want you to understand this matters. Legally, it does clear your father's name in the official record. Any document referencing the transfer will carry a notation. Anyone who looks at the county history will see it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "What does the process require?" He outlined it. She asked 4 questions. He answered 3 directly and said the 4th required additional research. She thanked him, and they agreed on his terms, which she paid from the money she'd been keeping in a separate section of the cigar box. For 2 months, she'd started setting it aside. The day after Silas had first mentioned the attorney, before she'd decided anything, because she'd learned a long time ago that preparation was not the same thing as commitment, but that it didn't hurt. Gatch looked at the payment, then at her with a slightly recalibrated expression, the look of a man adjusting his assumptions about who he'd been dealing with. On the ride back, Dell was diplomatically exhausted and slept against the stage wall for most of the first hour. Eliza and Silas sat across from each other with the particular tired quiet of 2 people who have just done something real together. "Thank you," she said. "You did that yourself. You made the introduction. You drove the conversation toward it in the first place." She looked out the window. "I'm not crediting you with more than you did. I'm crediting you with exactly what you did. Your father is going to get a different ending to this story than he expected," Silas said. "He doesn't know about it yet. I didn't want to tell him until there was something real to tell." She paused. "I haven't been back to Harlan's Creek in 4 years. I kept thinking I'd go when something had changed, when I had something different to show. You've built a business. That's mine, she said. The farm was his. Those are different things. He understood that distinction immediately, without her having to explain it. She noticed that about him, the things she didn't have to explain. They were back in Red Hollow by the following afternoon. The town had not changed. The gossip about the Helena trip would start within 24 hours and would be inaccurate in the specific ways that gossip is always inaccurate. It would get the facts roughly right and the meaning entirely wrong. Eliza had made her peace with that before she'd agreed to go. What she had not made her peace with, quite, was the auction. The annual Autumn Ranch Equipment Auction was the largest commercial event in Red Hollow's calendar, 3 days of buying and sellings that drew buyers and sellers from 4 counties. Every rancher of consequence attended. Every business owner sent someone. The main street was packed, the hotel was full, and the social dynamics of the town compressed into 3 days of forced proximity that left everyone with new information about everyone else. Silas had business at the auction. She knew that. She also knew, because Dell had mentioned it with the careful casualness of a man planting information, that Silas had been asked by 3 separate families whether he would be bringing someone to the auction dinner on the second evening, which was the kind of question that wasn't really a question. Eliza had not been asked that question, which was partly because no one expected Silas to bring her, and partly because the kind of women who got asked that question about the kind of men like Silas Mercer were not seamstresses with rooms above a laundry. She went to the auction on the first morning because she needed leather thread from a vendor who only came through during auction season. She made her purchase, was turning to leave, and nearly walked directly into Clara Hargrove, who was standing with 2 other women from the church committee, wearing an expression of prepared pleasantness that was somehow worse than hostility. "Eliza," Clara said in the tone of someone exercising charity. "Clara," Eliza said in the tone of someone who has stopped caring whether charity is being exercised or not. "I heard you went to Helena," Clara said. "Business, I imagine." "Yes." "Silas Mercer's business?" "My business," Eliza said, which happened to intersect with Mr. Mercer's connections in Helena. "Same as the work shirts I made for his ranch hands. Same as the curtains. Business." Clara smiled with her mouth. "Course. I only ask because people are wondering." "People can wonder," Eliza said pleasantly. "Have a good morning, Clara." She walked away before she could say anything less measured, which took more effort than it should have. The auction's second morning was when everything became concrete. She was crossing the main street, heading back from a fitting appointment, when she heard the noise from the auction square, not the ordinary noise of bidding and commerce, but the particular swell of a crowd that has just witnessed something unexpected. She moved toward it before she thought about whether she should. The square was packed. 300 people, maybe more, pressed around the central platform where the larger equipment lots were being auctioned. She couldn't see clearly from the edge, so she moved through the crowd until she could. Silas was standing in the center of the square, not on the platform beside it, in the open space between the platform and the crowd. He was not looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at the crowd, scanning it, and she understood with a start that he had been looking for her specifically. She didn't move. She stood where she was, with the crowd pressing around her, and watched him find her face. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped fully into the open space and spoke loudly enough that the 200 nearest people heard every word. "I want to say something," he said, which was not a particularly eloquent opening. But then he'd said once that he preferred things said plainly, and he was practicing what he'd described. Crowd, sensing something more interesting than equipment lots, went mostly quiet. "I've been doing business in this town and this county for 6 years, he said. "I've kept my own counsel about most things. I'm going to not do that for the next 2 minutes." He looked back at her, steadily, across the open space and the watching crowd. "Eliza Rowan is the most capable person I have encountered in 6 years of running a ranch, managing accounts, and dealing with the full range of people this territory produces. She found a supplier fraud that cost me $40 a month. She identified a water rights gap that might have cost me the Eastern Quarter. She is doing this county a service that it hasn't yet figured out how to acknowledge by staying in a sewing shop, because nobody in Red Hollow has had the sense to offer her something commensurate with what she's actually worth." There were murmurs now. Not hostile ones, surprised ones. the sound a crowd makes when the situation has departed from their expectations. I also want to say, he continued, because he was committed now, and there was no graceful way to do half of this, that I have been finding excuses to spend time with her since August. She has been patient about the excuses, and I would like to stop making excuses. The crowd was very quiet. Eliza stood in the middle of it and felt something she hadn't expected, not the embarrassment she'd braced for, not the hot exposure of being publicly named. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with being seen, plainly and completely, in front of people who had spent 3 years seeing her as the woman who picked her wages out of the dirt. Silas walked across the open space toward her. He stopped when he was close enough to speak without the whole crowd hearing every word, though the nearest people could certainly still hear some of it. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you already are," he said. "I'm not asking you to be quieter or softer or more convenient for anyone. I'm asking you, in front of all these people, because you deserve to have this said where everyone can hear it, will you let me court you properly?" It was not a question shaped like a question. It was a question shaped like a statement, which was his habit. She looked at him, and she thought about everything she'd decided about men like him, and about everything she'd observed that contradicted those decisions, and about her father in a 2-room house in Harlan's Creek, whose name was about to be corrected in a county record, and about the measuring tape, and about Dell with his hat in his hands, and about herself, at 27 years old, standing in a crowd of 300 people, being asked something real. She thought about all of it in approximately 4 seconds. Then she reached out and took his arm. Not dramatically, not with a speech. Just took his arm the way you take hold of something solid when you've decided to stop standing at a distance from it. Crowd made a sound. Not disapproval, something more complicated than that. The particular sound of people witnessing a thing they didn't expect and aren't entirely sure how to feel about. Clara Hargrove, standing 14 feet to the left, made no sound at all. Her expression was the expression of a woman whose calculations have just been significantly disrupted, and who needs more time than she currently has to recalibrate. Eliza did not look at Clara. She looked at Silas, who was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just done something he was terrified to do and found that it worked out, and who is not quite sure yet what to do with the relief of it. "You're going to have to deal with the things people say about this," she told him quietly, so only he could hear. "I know. And you're not going to manage me through any of it. I know that too." Good, she didn't release his arm. "The auctioneer is staring at us. He can wait, Silas." "He can wait," he said again, and there was enough of a smile in it that she let it go. They stood there in the middle of the auction square, with 300 people rearranging their opinions around them, and the auctioneer did wait, because some things can't be hurried and some moments don't care about the schedule, and even Red Hollow, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1882, was capable of recognizing the kind of thing that only happened once. Later that afternoon, when the auction had resumed its ordinary commerce and the crowd had dispersed into smaller conversations, Eliza sat in her shop and looked at the thread spools on the wall and thought about what had just happened with the particular clear-headedness that she reserved for things that had already been decided. She was not foolish enough to think it would be easy. The town would talk, was already talking, was probably going to be talking in the hotel bar, at that very moment, with opinions she'd never asked for about a choice she'd made in front of all of them. Clara Hargrove's accounting of the afternoon would circulate by tomorrow, and it would be vivid and editorial and wrong in the ways that suited it. She would still pick her wages out of the dirt if she had to. She would still build what she had built and protect it with the same care she always had. That hadn't changed. Silas Mercer's arm was not a rescue. She knew that. She thought he knew it too. But she also sat in her shop that afternoon and allowed herself something she hadn't allowed herself in a very long time. The possibility that 2 people could stand beside each other without one of them diminishing to make room. It was a modest thing to hope for. In her experience, modest things were the ones most likely to actually survive contact with reality. She pulled the thread spool she needed from the wall and went back to work. And for the first time in 3 years, the shop felt less like a place she had settled for and more like a place she was choosing. That was enough for now. It was more than enough. The talk lasted longer than Eliza had predicted, which was saying something, because she'd predicted it would last a considerable while. Red Hollow in October was a town that had already exhausted most of its seasonal news the harvest was in. The summer disputes had settled or calcified, and the auction was over, which meant that what had happened in the auction square landed into a near-perfect information vacuum and spread accordingly. By the third day after Silas's declaration, Eliza had heard 4 distinct versions of the event from 4 different customers, each version slightly more dramatic than the previous, until the 4th account had Silas standing on the actual auction platform with his hat in his hand, which had not happened, though she could see the narrative logic that had produced the embellishment. She corrected nothing. She had learned years ago that correcting gossip only extended its life. What she did instead was work. The 4 ranch hand shirts were done and delivered. Agnes Park's daughter had a relined winter coat that would hold against a Montana January. 2 new customers had come in, women she didn't know, from homestead claims east of town, who'd apparently heard through a chain of secondhand conversations that Eliza Rowan did honest work at honest prices and didn't gossip about what she heard in her shop, which was a reputation she'd built deliberately and valued more than she valued most things. Silas came by on Friday, the 3rd day after the auction, and sat in the chair across from her work table, and did not mention the auction at all, which she appreciated. They talked about the Eastern Quarter Easement Challenge, which had produced a counterfiling from the railroad that was aggressive, but apparently legally thin, according to the county surveyor who'd looked at it. They talked about Agnes Park's husband, and whether there was any winter work at the ranch, that a man with a healing broken leg could manage something sedentary, something that paid. Silas said he'd think about it. She knew he'd do more than think. After he left, Mrs. Pruitt came in for her usual Thursday appointment, which had migrated to Friday this week for reasons involving a school recital. He came by, the school teacher observed, unnecessarily. He did, Eliza agreed. He didn't stay long. He had a ranch to run. Mrs. Pruitt arranged herself on the fitting stool with the air of someone who has something to say and is choosing her moment. I want you to know, she said, that there are women in this town who are pleased about what happened at the auction, who aren't saying so because it's easier not to, but who are pleased. Eliza paused in her measuring. Is that right? It is. Clara Hargrove has a loud voice. She doesn't have as many allies as she thinks she does, Mrs. Pruitt held still for the measuring tape. I'm not one of them. I thought you should know. Thank you, Eliza said. She meant it. What she didn't tell, Mrs. Pruitt didn't tell anyone, because it wasn't ready to be told yet, was that Silas had asked her something on the Thursday before the auction, quietly, without the crowd and without the declaration. He'd asked her if she would consider marrying him. Not a formal proposal. More like a question offered in advance of a proposal to establish whether the proposal would be welcome before he made it. He'd framed it exactly that way, which she'd found both practical and unexpectedly. Disarm, I want to ask you something formal in a way that puts you in a difficult position, if your answer is no. So I'm asking you informally first. Is this something you'd consider? She had not said yes. She had not said no. She had said she needed to think about what marriage actually meant to her, which was not evasion. She'd thought about it carefully afterward, and found that the obstacle was not feeling, which was present and real and stronger than she'd have preferred for comfort's sake, but practicality. She had spent 3 years building something that was entirely hers. A legal marriage in 1,882 Montana territory meant that everything she'd built transferred, in the eyes of the law, to her husband. The shop, the accounts, the cooperative arrangements she'd started with 2 other women who brought in piecework. All of it would become, legally, his, not because he would exercise that right, but because the right existed and she had no mechanism to revoke it. She had not told him this because she was still working out whether it was a problem she could solve or a wall she was going to have to decide how to live beside. The letter from Warren Gatch's office in Helena arrived on a Monday in late October. The record correction proceeding had been filed. Henry Marsh, the Harlan's Creek clerk, had agreed to provide a written statement, not a full testimony, not a legal affidavit, but a witnessed written account of his observations at the time of the original transaction. Gatch wrote that it was not as strong as a deposition but was stronger than nothing, and that combined with the documentary inconsistencies he'd found in the county files, he was cautiously optimistic about the outcome. He expected a ruling within 60 days. Eliza read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer with the previous correspondence. Then she sat very still for a few minutes, doing nothing, which was not something she did often. The image she had in that stillness was of her father at 61 in a two-room house, with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped expecting things to change. She was going to have to go back to Harlan's Creek. She was going to have to tell him in person, because he deserved to hear this from her face and not from a piece of paper. She wrote to him that afternoon, not about the proceeding, not yet, just to say she was coming, that she had something she wanted to talk about, that she hoped he was well, and that she was, too, for the first time in a while. She told Silas about the letter on Thursday. He read it standing up, the way he read things he was concentrating on, and when he finished, he set it down with the careful attention of a man who knows this belongs to someone else's feeling, and is trying to be in the right place relative to it. "When are you going?" he asked. "I need to arrange the shop. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll come with you." He said it as a statement, then caught himself. "If you want me to. It's your family. I'll go or not go, whichever you want." She thought about it. "I want you to come," she said. "But I want to speak to my father alone first. Before introductions. Of course, he's going to have opinions. About you. About all of it, I'd expect him to. He's not going to be easy about it." She looked at Silas evenly. He spent 8 years being told the world wasn't fair and discovering that was true. That makes a man careful about people who seem to be offering things. "I understand that," Silas said. She believed him. They left for Harlan's Creek on a Tuesday in early November, with Dell again providing the logistical cover of his presence, and with the weather being exactly as unpleasant, as November in Montana generally was cold and gray and indifferent to anyone's plans. Harlan's Creek was smaller than Eliza remembered it, which was partly time and partly that she'd grown used to Red Hollow, which was itself not large. The main street was shorter than she'd carried it in her memory. The general store had a new sign. The county office, where her father had signed away his farm, was painted a different color, which she found she had no particular feeling about. Jacob Rowan's two-room house was at the edge of town, on a lot that wasn't worth much, with a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter. He'd kept it neat, which told her something a man who'd given up entirely didn't bother with the garden. He was smaller than she remembered too. Not diminished, exactly. He was still upright and deliberate in his movements, still had the careful eyes of a man who read things twice before accepting them. But the 8 years had taken something from him, the way 8 years of sustained disappointment takes something from anyone. He looked at her from the doorway, and the expression that crossed his face was the expression of a father who has been pretending not to be waiting and has just stopped pretending. "Eliza," he said. "Pa!" She went up the steps and he held the door and she hugged him, which neither of them was particularly practiced at anymore, and which was therefore genuine in the specific way that unpracticed things sometimes are. She sat with him in the kitchen while the cold pressed against the windows, and she told him slowly, in the order that made sense, about Warren Gatch and Henry Marsh's letter, and the proceeding, and what a record correction meant. She used the plain language she'd used with Gatch, not what it couldn't do, but what it could. What his name would look like in the county record when it was done. Jacob Rowan sat across from his daughter and listened without interrupting. He was the kind of man who listened the same way she did completely, and without performing reactions. When she finished, there was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Henry Marsh wrote it down," he said finally. "He did. I always thought he knew." He looked at his hands on the table. He had a particular look that day. "I told myself I was imagining it because I wanted someone to have seen it." He saw it. Jacob was quiet again. "What happens if the ruling goes through? To the record, I mean. What changes? Anyone who looks at the Rowan name in the Harlan's Creek County files will see that the 1,871 land transfer was achieved through fraudulent contract construction. That's the formal language. It becomes part of the permanent record." She looked at her father. "You didn't lose the farm because you were foolish or careless. Everyone who looks at the history will see that." He nodded slowly. The nod of a man absorbing something he'd stopped allowing himself to hope for. "It doesn't get the land back," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I stopped thinking about the land a long time ago. The land was a piece of dirt. It was what the taking of it said about me that I couldn't put down." He looked at her across the table. "You did this, with help." From who? She told him about Silas. Not everything, not the auction, not the full arc of how they'd arrived here, but enough. The attorney connection. The role he'd played in moving the process forward. Jacob listened. Is he the man who came with you? I saw someone with Dell when you walked up. Yes. A pause. Who is he to you? She considered how to answer that. Someone I trust, she said finally, which I don't say about many people. Her father looked at her with the measuring look of a parent who knows their child and knows what that sentence cost. Send him in, he said. I'll put coffee on. The conversation between Jacob Rowan and Silas Mercer was not easy and was not supposed to be. Jacob asked direct questions in the manner of a man who'd had his trust taken once at cost and had no intention of being careless with it again. He asked about the ranch, about the manner in which Silas had acquired and maintained it, about his family, about his father. He did not ask about intentions in the flowery way the word was usually used. He asked practically, the way a man asks when he wants to know what someone is actually planning, not what sounds correct. Silas answered all of it without performing. He did not attempt to charm Jacob Rowan, which was the right instinct. Jacob was not a man who responded to charm and would have found it insulting. He answered with information and honesty, including an honest accounting of the Harrow situation, which he described plainly and without flattering his own role in it. Jacob listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions. He poured more coffee. At the end of it, he looked at Silas and then looked at his daughter and then looked back at his table, at the grain of the wood. She's not easy, he said to Silas in the tone of a man delivering a fact rather than a warning. I know, Silas said. I consider that a substantial advantage. Jacob made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Quickly managed. He stood up and shook Silas's hand. It was not approval. Exactly, it was acknowledgement, which from Jacob Rowan was not a lesser thing. They stayed 2 nights. The second evening, after Silas and Dell had retired to the boarding house on the main street, Eliza sat with her father at the kitchen table, and they talked the way they hadn't talked in years past, past the careful surface management of 2 people who love each other and have learned not to press on the places that hurt. He told her about the 8 years. Not the external events, she knew the outline of those, but the texture of them. The specific weight of being looked at in a small town as the man who'd lost his property. The way certain people had revised their account of him retroactively, finding foolishness and improvidence in a man who had been neither. The way he'd eventually stopped going to certain places, because the effort of managing other people's revised opinion of him had become more than he wanted to spend. She listened the way he'd taught her to listen, completely and without interrupting. You should have come back sooner, he said, not accusatory, just factual. I know, she said. I kept thinking I needed to arrive with something. You didn't need to bring anything. I know that now. He looked at her across the table. This Silas. Yes, he watches you, Jacob said. When you're talking to someone else, not the possessive kind of watching. The kind where a person is paying attention, taking note. He turned his coffee cup. Your mother had a way of looking at me like that when we were first together. Like she was learning something new about me and wanted to make sure she got it right. Eliza said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Don't wait too long, her father said, to decide. Not because of anything other than life goes by. And the waiting doesn't preserve anything. It just takes up time that could have been something else. She drove back to Red Hollow 3 days later with that sentence sitting somewhere in the middle of her chest, not resolving into anything specific, just present. The thing she'd been working on privately, the legal question about marriage and property, had taken a shape she hadn't expected. She'd written to a woman lawyer in Butte, whose name she'd found in a legal circular that Gatch had sent along with his case materials. Women lawyers were not common and were not, in most jurisdictions, recognized at all, but Montana Territory had a more complicated relationship with convention than most places, and the woman whose name was Frances Aldis had been practicing land and contract law for 4 years through a male colleague's license, which was its own commentary on the state of things. Frances Aldis had written back with 3 pages of dense, practical information about the legal instruments available to a woman in Montana Territory who wished to protect property she'd built prior to marriage. It was not a complete solution. The law was not organized in her favor and wasn't about to reorganize itself for her convenience. But there were mechanisms of prenuptial agreement of the kind used in mercantile partnerships, a separate business trust, a formal record of prior ownership that could establish the shop and its assets as antecedent to the marriage contract. None of it was perfect. All of it required Silas to formally agree to terms that most men in his position would find unnecessary at best and offensive at worst. She brought it to him on a Tuesday evening in late November, without preface, setting Francis Aldis's letter and her own 2 pages of notes on his desk. He read everything. He took longer than she expected, which meant he was reading carefully, rather than skimming. When he finished, he set the papers down. "You've been working on this," he said. "Since September." He looked at her. "Since September. Before the auction." "Yes." "So while you were deciding whether to," he stopped. "Started again. You were doing this at the same time." "I was thinking about practical reality. At the same time, I was thinking about everything else," she said. "That's how I think, parallel." He was quiet for a moment. "You thought I'd refuse. I thought it was possible." "Do you still think it's possible?" She looked at him steadily. "No, but I needed to know I'd asked. I needed the conversation to be real, not assumed." She touched the edge of the papers. "If you agree to these terms, the business trust, the prenuptial agreement recognizing the shop and all its assets as my separate property, then, when you ask me the question again, I can answer it." He looked at the papers. He looked at her. He said, "Get a pen." "Silas, get a pen," he said again. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. Tonight, if you have what's required. Because the question I asked you a month ago is still the question I want the answer to, and I would like to stop waiting for it." She didn't move for a moment. Then she opened the desk drawer, which she now knew as well as her own, and took out a pen. They spent 2 hours going through the documents together. Not because the signing was complicated, but because she wanted him to understand every term he was agreeing to, and he wanted to understand them, and that process took the time it took. He asked 3 questions. She answered them. He suggested one modification to the business trust language that was actually an improvement, which she acknowledged and noted. When it was done, the signed document sat between them on the desk, and the room was very quiet. "Now," Silas said, "Eliza Rowan, will you marry me?" Again, not a question shaped like a question. His habit. She had thought about what she would feel at this moment. She had tried to predict it with the analytical instinct that had gotten her through most of the difficult things in her life. She had predicted something measured, thoughtful, careful. What she actually felt was simpler than that and less manageable. Something that had been compressed for a long time, releasing itself into the available space, quiet and enormous at the same time. The way water moves when a dam finally allows it. "Yes," she said. Not a speech, not a condition. Just the word delivered plainly, the way she delivered everything she meant. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Not dramatically. Just took it, the way you take hold of something you've been waiting to reach, and held it there on top of the documents they'd just signed. And neither of them said anything for a while. Because sometimes the thing that needs to be communicated is communicated best in the not saying of it. Dell found out the next morning when Silas told him directly over breakfast, which was not how Dell had expected to find out. He'd expected something more theatrical, and he received the information with a composure that lasted approximately 15 seconds before he pumped Silas's hand 4 times with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting for this news since approximately the 2nd Thursday of August. The wedding was set for early spring. Eliza told her father by letter, a longer letter than she usually wrote, and his response came back in 11 days, which was faster than his letters usually arrived. It said 3 sentences: that he was glad, that he would come, that she should not spend money on flowers because they died, but should spend it on something that lasted. She read it in her shop on a morning in early December, with the first real snow pressing against the windows, sitting in the chair behind her work table, with the letter in one hand and the other hand flat on the wooden surface of the table she'd bought secondhand 3 years ago when she'd first rented this space. The table that had her accounts scratched into its underside where she'd been testing a new ledger system and run out of paper. The table that had held Clara Hargrove's blouses on the day it had all begun, and every job since. She put the letter down and looked at the shop, the thread spools on the wall in their careful order, the pattern books stacked by the window, the 2 chairs she'd recently added for customers who needed to wait, the small stove that kept the temperature livable through the Montana winter. She had built this from nothing. She was going to keep building it. Those two things were not in conflict. She had made sure of that, 2 pages of legal documents at a time. The snow was coming harder now, pressing flat against the glass. Somewhere across town, she knew, Silas was at his desk with a ledger she'd helped him redesign in October, going through accounts with the methodical patience he'd developed and the eye for supplier discrepancies she'd taught him. Dell was probably in the barn doing something with a horse. Agnes Park's husband was doing whatever light work Silas had found for him. She'd confirmed he'd followed through on that. Of course he had. She picked up the scissors and went back to work. The coat on the table was for a woman who'd come in that morning from a claim 30 miles east, a woman she'd never met before, who had a child on her hip and a look in her eyes that Eliza recognized the way you recognize some things you've seen in a mirror. The coat needed the lining replaced and one button reattached, and the left cuff let out by a full inch because the woman's wrists were raw from cold and she needed the fabric to cover them. Eliza had given her a price that was barely above materials. The woman had looked at her with the particular look of someone trying to determine whether kindness came with conditions. Eliza had just said, "Come back Thursday for the fitting," and gone back to the cutting table, because the fastest way to establish that there were no conditions was to have none. She worked through the morning with the snow thickening outside and the stove ticking behind her, and she thought about spring and about her father making the trip from Harlan's Creek and about the legal documents in her desk drawer and about what Warren Gatch's final ruling would say when it came 60 days he'd estimated, and they were 40 days into the wait. She thought about the Rowan name in the county record at Harlan's Creek, and what it would look like when the correction was appended, and about her father reading it, if he chose to, and what that might do to the particular set of his shoulders that she'd been carrying in her memory since the day she was 19, and had watched him walk away from something that had been his. She was not given to sentiment as a general practice, but she allowed herself, in the privacy of her shop on a snowy December morning, to feel the full weight of what was coming, not just the marriage, not just the legal correction, but the accumulation of it, the long, slow arc from the dirt of the Founders' Festival to here, and the particular knowledge that every step of the arc had been walked on her own terms. No one had handed this to her. No one had rescued her from it. She had built it the way she built everything coin by coin, decision by decision, one careful and imperfect choice after another. Coat took 3 hours. She folded it, pinned the alterations she'd marked for the Thursday fitting, and set it on the shelf. The finished and in-progress work lived side by side. She was already thinking about what the shop could become. Not just a shop. She'd been turning over an idea for 2 months now, something she hadn't said out loud yet, because the saying of it made it real and real things could be lost. But the idea was there, specific and practical, and growing more detailed every time she pressed on it. She was going to need to write it down. She was going to need to run the numbers. She was going to need more shelf space. She pulled out the ledger and opened it to the next blank page and began. Warren Gatch's letter arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of January, which Eliza would later think was fitting. Thursdays had carried most of the significant things in the last several months, and it seemed consistent that this one would too. She was alone in the shop when it came, the delivery boy dropping it through the mail slot with the indifference of someone who doesn't know what he's carrying. She picked it up from the floor, saw the Helena return address, and set it on the work table without opening it for a full 2 minutes. She finished the seam she was working on. She put the garment down. She picked up the letter. The ruling had come through. Gatch's language was measured in the way of a man who has learned to deliver news without inflation. But the substance was clear. The Harlan's Creek County land records had been formally amended to append a correction to the 1,871 transfer of the Rowan farm. The official notation would read that the transfer had been achieved through a contract subsequently determined to contain fraudulent material misrepresentation, and that the original owner, Jacob Rowan, bore no fault in the loss of the property. Henry Marsh's written account had been accepted as supporting documentation. The county clerk had signed the amendment 3 days prior. It was done. Eliza read it twice. Then she sat down in the customer's chair rather than her own, because her own chair was behind the work table, and she needed to be on the other side of the table for this. She sat with the letter in her lap and looked at the middle distance, at nothing in particular, and allowed herself a few minutes of feeling the full size of what this was, without immediately organizing it into the next thing to do. Her father's name was in a county record, the right version of it, the true version. She had started this process last September, with a letter to a frightened old clerk and no certainty that anything would come of it. She had arrived at January with a legal ruling, a signed prenuptial agreement, and a wedding planned for March. She had also, in the same period, signed a lease extension on the shop, taken on 2 women who did piecework through her on a profit-sharing arrangement, that she'd written up herself with Francis Aldis's help, and reorganized the account books in a way that had already identified $40 in previously missed supplier overcharges. None of it had been smooth. 2 of the women she'd approached about the piecework arrangement had declined, one politely and one with a suspicion that Eliza found more understandable than insulting. The lease extension had required a direct conversation with her landlord, who had initially tried to raise the rate by 15% on the assumption that her improved circumstances meant she could absorb it, and had revised the number after she'd laid 3 competing rental quotes on his desk without comment. The account reorganization had caused a genuine argument with Silas, their first real one, about whether his ranch's grain supplier was being dishonest or merely inconsistent in his invoicing, and it had resolved in her favor only after she'd pulled 6 months of invoices and demonstrated the pattern, at which point Silas had said she was right and meant it, though he'd been irritated about it for a day first. She had learned in that argument that they were capable of one, that it didn't end things or hollow them out, that he could be wrong and say so, and that she could be right without making a monument of it, and that both of those things were possible to sustain inside a single relationship between 2 imperfect people who had decided to try. She wrote to her father that afternoon. She told him about the ruling in the plainest language she had, which was the only language she trusted for things this important. She told him what the record would say and where it would be, and that it was permanent. She told him she would bring him a certified copy when she came to collect him for the wedding in March. Then she walked to the ranch to tell Silas in person, because some things deserved to be said out loud rather than preserved in careful sentences. He was in the yard when she arrived, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected to find him at the desk. He and Dell were replacing a section of the fence along the eastern boundary, the postwork kind that required both of them, and a good deal of physical effort, and they were both dirty and slightly out of breath. Dell saw her first and straightened up and found something to do at the far end of the fence line, with the efficiency of a man who has gotten very good at this. Silas turned. He read something in her face before she said a word. She could see him do it, the particular attention sharpening. The letter came, he said. Yes. And? She told him. He listened, standing in the cold with his work gloves still on, and when she finished he nodded the way. He nodded when something mattered, not a performance of response, just acknowledgement, real and direct. Your father's going to see that copy, he said. I'm bringing it in March. He pulled off one glove and reached across and took her hand, which she was cold enough to appreciate practically as well as everything else. They stood there for a moment in the gray January air, and she felt the particular rightness of telling him things not because he fixed them or resolved them, because he received them with the weight they deserved and then stood alongside them with her. There's something else, she said. He waited. I want to talk about the workroom idea, properly. Numbers and structure, not just concept. She'd mentioned it once, in November, only enough to establish that the idea existed. She hadn't gone further because she'd needed the ruling. First, needed to know the Harlan's Creek situation was resolved before she could think clearly about the next thing. I'm ready to go into the details. Tonight, he said. Come for dinner. Bring your ledger. She brought the ledger. She also brought 3 pages of notes and the draft structural proposal she'd been refining since December, which laid out what she was calling a cooperative workroom, a shared production space where women who sewed, mended, or did decorative textile work could pool their materials, share tools and equipment, and each retain an ownership stake in the collect-out rather than working as individual contractors who ate all their own overhead separately. It was not a radical idea in concept. Frontier women had been sharing labor informally since the territory was settled. What Eliza was proposing was to formalize it, to give it a legal structure and a shared account and a name so that the thing they were building together couldn't be casually disassembled by circumstance or the departure of any single person. Silas listened to the full presentation, which took 40 minutes and involved her standing up twice to diagram something on the back of one of his blank ledger pages. He asked 8 questions, all of them practical, none of them skeptical, the questions of someone trying to understand the plan rather than find objection to it. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the diagram she'd drawn. The biggest problem is startup capital, he said. Equipment, the shared space, materials float. I know. I have some of it. Not all. How much short, she told him. He thought for a moment. I'll put in the difference as a loan. Not a gift alone, with the terms written up through Francis Aldous, the same way the business trust was written. You pay it back from the workroom's revenues on whatever schedule makes sense. She looked at him. You're not going to suggest I simply accept the money. No. Most men would. Most men are trying to own things by giving them, he said. I'm trying to help you build something that's yours. Those are different operations. He picked up the diagram. I want the loan terms to include a provision that I have no claim on the workroom's assets or income. Frances can write that in. She can, Eliza said. She looked at him with the look she rarely let all the way through the one without the management, the one that was just what it was. Why did I trust you? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. I think, he said, because I never tried to make you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her ledger. I'll write to Frances tomorrow. The Rowan workroom was incorporated as a legal cooperative entity on the 14th of February, 1883, which was not chosen for the date's conventional associations, but because that was when Francis Aldous had the paperwork finalized, and Eliza had long since stopped caring what symbolic weight other people attached to calendars. Founding members were 3. Eliza herself, a woman named Ruth Candler, who had been doing piecework through the shop since October and had a gift for complex embroidery that was genuinely underpriced in the market, and Agnes Park, whose husband's leg had healed enough by January that he no longer needed the ranch work, and who had come into the shop in late December and said, in the direct way of a woman who has stopped waiting for permission, that she had skills and needed a proper arrangement and had heard Eliza was building one. Agnes Park had 7 children and a husband who was a good man and a mediocre farmer, and who had said, when Agnes told him what she planned, that he didn't understand it, but that she'd been right about most things for 15 years, and he saw no particular reason to doubt her now. The workroom took a space behind Eliza's existing shop, a storage room that the landlord had been using for nothing in particular, renegotiated into the lease at a rate that reflected its current contribution to his income, which was 0. The equipment was purchased in 2 stages, the second stage funded by Silas's loan, with terms that Francis Aldous had written to be so clearly in the workroom's favor that Silas had read them and said, she really doesn't like the idea of a man having leverage, which was not inaccurate. By the first week of March, the Rowan workroom had 3 members, 4 pending orders, 1 shared pressing iron, and a handwritten set of operating rules that Eliza had drafted and all 3 women had modified and signed. The rules were practical and specific, how profits were calculated, how disputes were resolved, how new members could apply and on what terms, how the shared account was managed, and who had access to it. Nothing flowery, nothing about shared purpose or feminine solidarity, because Eliza had learned that the fastest way to kill a practical arrangement was to dress it in language that embarrassed people when things got difficult. It was not perfect. Ruth Candler and Agnes Park had a disagreement in the second week about the pricing on a large embroidery commission, kind of disagreement that happens when 2 capable women who've both been undervalued for years are suddenly in a situation where they have to negotiate their own worth with each other instead of accepting whatever they're offered. Eliza mediated it by pulling out the operating rules and pointing at the pricing formula all 3 of them had agreed to, which resolved the immediate question and also established, usefully, that the rules were going to be treated as rules rather than suggestions. Afterward, Agnes said to Eliza, that was unpleasant. Yes, Eliza agreed. Is it going to happen again? Probably. We're 3 women who've all been managing things alone for a long time. That creates habits that don't always cooperate. Agnes considered this. But the formula worked. The formula worked, Eliza confirmed. Agnes nodded once, with the air of a woman updating her assessment of something. Fine, she said. Then we keep going. They kept going. Jacob Rowan arrived in Red Hollow on the 6th of March, 2 days before the wedding, on the same stage line that had brought Eliza to town 3 years earlier. He was thinner than he'd been in November, which concerned her until she watched him move, still deliberate, still upright, still with the careful eyes, and concluded it was winter rather than decline. She met him at the stage stop with the certified copy of the County Land Record Amendment in an envelope which she handed him before she hugged him, because she thought he needed to see it first and everything else could wait. He opened it at the stage stop, standing in the early March cold, and read it where he stood. She watched his face. He read it twice, the way he read everything, and then he folded it back into the envelope and held it against his chest for a moment, not dramatically, not with any performance of emotion, just the way a person holds something they've been waiting for long enough that receiving it requires a second integrate. Then he looked at her. You did this, he said. With Silas's contacts and Warren Gatch's work, she said, because she'd given this answer before and meant it before and still meant it. You started it, her father said. You wrote the letter. Nobody else was going to write the letter. He put the envelope carefully in his coat's inside pocket, where he would carry it for the rest of the day. Thank you. She had not prepared for that to be as hard to receive as it was. She managed it, because she always managed things, but she looked away for a moment at the street and the stage horses being changed over and the ordinary business of a Wednesday morning in a small town, and breathed once, deliberately. Come on, she said. I'll show you the workroom. He walked through the Rowan workroom with the specific attention of a man who built things with his hands for 20 years, stopping at the pressing table to examine how it was braced, running a thumb along the edge of the cutting surface to check its level, looking at the shelving arrangement with the critical eye of someone calculating load and accessibility. Ruth Candler was there working on the embroidery commission, and she nodded at Jacob with the self-possession of a woman who has decided she belongs in a professional space and has stopped apologizing for it. Agnes Park arrived at 11 with her oldest daughter, who had been enlisted to help with a large hemming order, and introduced herself to Jacob with a directness that he clearly appreciated. Jacob watched all of it. Then he came to stand beside Eliza at the front of the space and said quietly, You named it Rowan. It's my name, she said. It's mine too, he said. And there was something in the way he said it not proprietary, not possessive. Just the plain recognition of a man who'd spent 8 years watching his name mean something diminished and was looking at it now, meaning something else entirely. She let him have that. It was his too. The wedding on the 8th of March was not large. Eliza had not wanted large. She'd been looked at by crowds enough in the past year to last her some time, and the idea of organizing her own marriage around other people's expectations seemed like an ironic note to start on. It was the judge's chambers and 12 people, which included Dell, Mrs. Pruitt, Ruth Candler, Agnes Park, Jacob Rowan, and 7 others who mattered in the specific real way rather than the social way. She wore the dress she'd made herself in January, which had taken her 3 weeks because she'd started twice and discarded both starts, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate, but which had to do with the fact that this particular garment needed to be right in a way that went past technical correctness. The third attempt was dark blue wool with ivory collar work that she'd done herself over 2 evenings, practical enough for Montana in March and precise enough to reflect the care she'd taken. She was not interested in beauty as performance. She was interested in the dress being something she'd made herself, from cloth she'd chosen, with her own hands, which seemed like the only appropriate way to arrive at this particular occasion. Silas wore a suit she'd never seen before, which told her he'd acquired it for this purpose, and had not told her, which she found unexpectedly charming. The judge was brief and practical, which suited everyone present. Dell cried, which he would deny for the rest of his natural life, and which Jacob Rowan observed with the slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a full smile. Afterward, in the small room that the hotel had set aside for the gathering, Eliza stood with her father while the others talked around them, and he held a glass of something he wasn't drinking, and she held one she was. And for a while they didn't say anything because they'd said the important things already, and the rest could wait. Are you happy? He asked, finally. She thought about the question honestly, the way he'd always taught her to think about things. Yes, she said, not in the way I expected to be. It's more solid than I expected. Less like a feeling and more like a fact. He nodded. That made sense to him. Your mother was like that for me, he said. Not a feeling I was having. A fact about the world. She looked at him. He didn't speak about her mother, often not from unwillingness, but from the particular reticence of a man for whom some things were too large for casual mention. I miss her, Eliza said. So do I, he said. Every day. Differently now than before, but still. He turned his glass in his hands. She would have liked this. Not just him this. He gestured slightly, meaning the workroom, the legal documents, the whole structure of what she'd built. She had the same instinct you do. The building thing. The not waiting to be given permission thing. She just didn't have the same circumstances to practice it in. Eliza thought about her mother, who had died when Eliza was 14 and whom she remembered in fragments the specific smell of her, the way she'd held fabric up to the window light to assess its quality, the tone of voice she'd used when she was disagreeing with something but wasn't going to fight about it in front of the children. I got it from her, Eliza said, whatever this is. I got it from her. I know, her father said. That's why I wanted to say it out loud. They had 3 days together before Jacob's stage back to Harlan's Creek. Eliza spent as much of it with him as the workroom and the shop, and the general business of her life allowed, which was not as much as she'd have liked, but was more than she'd managed in 4 years, and the accounting of it came out on the side of enough. They ate dinner together twice at the ranch, where Silas fed Jacob and asked him questions about farming with genuine curiosity, and Jacob answered them with the precision of a man who'd spent 20 years understanding a particular piece of land and still carried that understanding even after the land was gone. On the last evening, after Silas had tactfully found something to do elsewhere, Eliza walked her father back to the boarding house through the early March dark, and he told her that she should visit more. Not as a request, as a statement of something he'd decided. I'll come back in summer, she said. With the workroom more established, I can take a week. He said that was fine. They said goodnight at the boarding house steps, and she watched him go inside, and she stood there on the street for a moment after the door had closed, feeling the particular bittersweetness of a relationship that has been resumed after a gap long enough to have reshaped both people. She walked home through the cold and felt, along with everything else, a gratitude she didn't try to make neat or resolve into any particular lesson. Some things just were what they were. Spring came to Red Hollow with the aggressive urgency that follows a hard Montana winter, everything happening at once, the mud and the green arriving together, the days lengthening fast enough that you could notice the difference from week to week. The Rowan workroom expanded to 4 members in April when a woman named Catherine Bell came in from a claim that had failed. Her husband had pulled them out 2 years in. They'd come to town with very little, and she had a talent for fine lacework that was immediately useful and had been going completely unwaged because there'd been nowhere to bring it. Catherine Bell was quiet and precise, and slightly terrified of everything, in the way of a person who has recently had the ground shift under them and is still calibrating. Eliza recognized it. She didn't comment on it directly. She just gave Catherine work with clear terms and paid her on time and treated her expertise as expertise, which was, she'd found the fastest way to help someone rebuild their footing. Not charity, not commentary, just consistent, respectful transaction. By May, the workroom had 6 standing clients and had begun receiving orders from a millinery shop in Billings that had found them through a traveling merchant who'd seen Ruth Candler's embroidery work at the Red Hollow General Store. The Billings orders were the first revenue that clearly exceeded what the individual members would have earned separately. The cooperative structure was doing what she'd designed it to do, which was route larger commissions to a collective capacity that no single woman in the arrangement could have handled alone. She was running the May accounts on a Friday afternoon when Silas came into the shop from the connecting door to the workroom they'd put the door in April. A practical convenience that also meant she didn't have to go outside between the 2 spaces in bad weather and set a folded document on her desk. She looked up. What's this? The railroad easement challenge, he said. Final ruling came from the county this morning. She opened it. Read it. The ruling had found in the ranch's favor on 2 of the 3 contested points, which meant the proposed dam couldn't be built in the configuration the railroad had filed without negotiating proper compensation for the water diversion. The railroad had 90 days to refile or withdraw. They'll probably refile, she said. Probably. But the documentation gap is closed now. Whatever they file will have to deal with the correct record. He sat down across from her. You found that gap. You would have found it eventually. I wouldn't have found it before they filed their initial claim, he said, which was what mattered. She looked at him. Do you know what I've been thinking about? Tell me. The gap in the documentation, the Harlan's Creek contract, the supplier weights, all of it, they all worked the same way. Someone constructed something that looked correct on the surface and was wrong underneath, and was counting on nobody looking carefully enough or having enough standing to challenge it. She set the ruling down. That's the pattern. It's always the pattern. And the only defense against it is someone who reads carefully and has enough standing to make the challenge matter. You, he said. People like me. Women who've been reading documents by necessity since they were 19, who understand what the not said parts of a contract mean, because the not said parts are what took something from them. She looked at her account books. I want the workroom to do that, not just sewing. I want to teach the women who work here how to read a contract, how to spot the gaps, how to know when a document is designed to be misread. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's a different kind of operation than a workroom. It's both, she said. It has to be both. Because the women who come here, Catherine, Agnes, all of them, they're going to keep being handed documents they can't read, and being charged rates they can't verify, and paying for things at prices they can't confirm are honest. The sewing keeps the lights on. The other thing keeps them safe. He looked at her with the particular look that meant he was revising upward something he'd thought he'd already fully assessed. How? Slowly, she said. I start with the women I have, teaching them what I know, which is not formal legal knowledge, but is practical knowledge. Frances Aldous might be willing to come from Butte for a week. In the fall, she's mentioned interest in something like this. And once I have people who can read documents, they teach the next people. You're describing a school, he said. I'm describing a workroom that also teaches people not to be cheated, she said. I'm not calling it a school because that word will frighten people who don't think they're students. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, what do you need from me for this? Nothing right now. I'm telling you because I tell you things. She picked her pen back up. You can have opinions about it. My opinion is that it's the right thing to do and that you should do it. Then we agree. She went back to the accounts. He stayed where he was, across from her, reading through the easement ruling again. And the afternoon settled into the particular comfortable working quiet of two people who have figured out how to be in the same space without requiring anything from each other that the other isn't freely giving. The summer of 1883 moved fast and full. The workroom's billings connection grew into a regular arrangement, twice monthly orders, large enough that Eliza had started thinking about whether a fifth member made practical sense. Agnes Park's oldest daughter, who'd been helping with hemming since winter, was old enough and skilled enough that the conversation was becoming less hypothetical. Agnes brought it up herself, which was consistent with Agnes. The document literacy project, which Eliza had not named, because naming it would have made it formal, and formal made people nervous, had been running for 6 weeks by August. It looked, from outside the workroom, like nothing in particular. 4 women sitting around a table on Wednesday evenings with papers spread between them. Inside, it was Ruth Candler learning to identify the clause structure that marked a payment deferral as a penalty rather than a grace period. It was Catherine Bell understanding, for the first time, that the contract her husband had signed for their failed claim had contained a soil assessment contingency that the landowner had never fulfilled, which meant they'd had legal grounds to dissolve it 2 years earlier and hadn't known. That realization had sat with Catherine for 3 days, visible in her face, not anger exactly, but the specific feeling of understanding how something happened to you that you thought was simply bad luck, and discovering it was in fact something else. Eliza didn't try to resolve it for her. She just let it be real. Frances Aldous came for a week in September as promised. She was not what most people in Red Hollow had expected. She was 52, compact, had the manner of someone who had stopped being interested in other people's comfort levels. Approximately 20 years ago, and arrived with 2 cases full of documents she used as teaching materials. The week she spent in the workroom was the most intellectually demanding thing most of the women there has experienced since formal schooling, and it was made more demanding by the fact that the information was immediately practical. The gap between understanding and application was days rather than years. Dell, who had become aware of the Wednesday sessions through the natural permeability of small-town information, mentioned to Silas one morning that people were talking about what was happening in the workroom, and not with the discomfort he might have expected. It's more like curiosity, Dell said, even from people who'd normally find reasons to object, because everyone's been handed a bad contract at some point, and most people know it. Silas mentioned this to Eliza without framing it as anything, which was his way of offering information that she could use how she liked. She filed it. The evening after Francis Aldous left for Butte, Eliza walked back through the workroom alone after the others had gone, and stood in the middle of it in the particular tired satisfaction of a week that had taken everything she had. The new cutting table was against the east wall. The shelving she'd added in June was full. The small chalkboard she'd put up in April for the Wednesday sessions still had 3 questions written on it in her handwriting questions she'd assigned for the following week's discussion about how to identify an unconscionable contract term. She thought about Clara Hargrove dropping coins in the dirt on the main street of this town 13 months ago, about herself crouching in the mud to pick them up, one by one, while 30 people watched. She had not forgiven Clara Hargrove in any formal sense. She didn't think forgiveness was the right frame for it. What had happened was simpler than forgiveness. Clara Hargrove had tried to establish a fact about Eliza Rowan, that she was the kind of person things could be done to, with no consequence, and Eliza had spent the subsequent year demonstrating that the fact was wrong. Not as a project of revenge, as a project of construction. The demonstration was a side effect. She turned off the workroom lamp and went through the connecting door into the shop, and then through the shop's front door onto the main street, where the August evening was warm and the town was doing its ordinary evening things. Down the block, the hotel where the Harrows had stayed was lit up some other guests now, some other business. The gazebo in the square where the brass band played during the Founders' Festival was empty. She thought, in a few weeks it would be the second Founders' Festivals, since she'd stood on this street with her hand out and felt Clara Hargrove's coins fall past it. She would be at the festival this year as a property owner and a business owner and a wife, and a woman whose father's name had been corrected in a county record, 2 counties east. The thread connecting those 2 moments was not a dramatic arc. It was a long series of small decisions, most of them made alone, most of them unglamorous, many of them wrong in their first form and corrected in their second. That was the thing she'd tried to explain to Catherine Bell one Wednesday evening when Catherine had said, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been working very hard for what seems like insufficient return, whether it ever stopped feeling like she was just barely staying ahead of things. Eliza had thought about how to answer that honestly. I don't think the feeling stops, she'd said. I think what changes is what you're staying ahead of. At some point you look back and realize the things behind you are smaller than they were, that the ground you're covering is ground you built, not ground you're borrowing. She'd paused. And there are days that's not enough. There are days you're still just tired. I don't want to lie to you about that. Catherine had nodded, slowly, the way you nod when you're filing something, rather than responding to it. Standing now on the main street in the August evening, Eliza thought that she'd been telling the truth. There were still days that were just tiring. Days when the accounts didn't balance on the first try, and the supplier was slow, and a client wanted alterations that weren't what she'd ordered, and the workroom felt like a thing she was holding together with sustained personal will, rather than a thing that had achieved its own momentum. Those days still came. What had changed the thing she hadn't quite been able to articulate to Catherine, but which she understood now, standing here at the distance of a year, was that the hard days were happening inside something. Inside a structure she'd built and protected and made legally hers. The difficulty was still difficulty, but it was her difficulty, on her terms, in her space, with her name on the door. That was not a small thing. She had spent years not having it. She knew exactly what it was worth. She was standing there on the street, in no particular hurry to go anywhere, when she heard the stage. Evening stage from the east came through Red Hollow 3 times a week, and she had no particular reason to watch it. But something made her stay where she was as it pulled in at the stage, stopped down the block, and she watched the passengers disembark in the way you watch things when you're thinking about something else, and your eyes need somewhere to land. 3 passengers. A man with a trunk who looked like a merchant. An older couple who moved with the careful coordination of people who have been traveling for a long time and are relieved to have stopped. And a young woman, last off, who stepped down from the stage with one bag, not a trunk, not a case, a single bag, and stood on the street looking at the town with the particular stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere without quite knowing what they're going to do next. She was young, 20, maybe 21. She was wearing a coat that was too light for Montana even in August, which meant she'd come from somewhere warmer without enough time to prepare, which meant the departure had been fast. She held the bag in front of her with both hands, not the way you hold luggage, but the way you hold something when you need something to hold. Eliza recognized it. Not the specific version, she didn't know this girl's story, but the category. Particular look of someone who has arrived at the end of running without quite knowing what comes next. She walked down the block to the stage stop. The young woman heard her coming and looked up, and her expression was the expression of someone bracing for a transaction they're not sure they can afford. "I'm not selling anything," Eliza said. "Are you looking for the hotel?" "I was going to ask," the woman said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. I don't have much for lodging. I was hoping there might be something reasonable. Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house on 2nd Street takes women at $3 a week, and she'll negotiate the first week if you're looking for work." Eliza looked at her steadily, not with pity, which the woman didn't need and would have felt. "What kind of work can you do?" The woman looked at her. "I can sew and I can read and write and do figures. And I'm good at seeing when things don't add up. Numbers, accounts." Something moved in Eliza's chest, not sentiment, something practical. "What's your name?" "Violet," the woman said. "Violet Cross." Eliza Mercer. She'd been using it for 6 months now, and it still sat slightly differently in her mouth than Rowan did. Not wrong, just different. She used both. Depending on context, which Silas had said was fine, and which Francis Aldous had said was legally fine too. "Come and see the workroom tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Violet Cross looked at her. "Why? Because you just described 2 things we need." Eliza picked up her own pace toward home. "Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house is 3 blocks north, left on 2nd. Tell her I sent you." She left Violet Cross on the street with the information and the direction and the appointment, and nothing further, because that was the kind of help that held specific, practical, no performance of generosity that would make the other person feel they owed something they'd have to repay. At night, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with Silas in the August dark and told him about it. He listened. He said, "How many is that now in the workroom?" 5 members. Violet would be 6th if she wants it. If she's got the skills she described. Do you think she does? I think she described them the way someone describes things they actually have, not the way someone describes things they're trying to convince you of. She leaned her shoulder against his. "We'll find out tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to build this into something I won't be able to picture from here." "Probably," she agreed. "I want to see it, you'll see it," she said. "It's going to take longer than either of us thinks." The night was clear. The way Montana nights are clear, the whole weight of the sky visible. More stars than anyone from a settled place could account for. The ranch was quiet. From the barn, one of the horses shifted. Down the slope, the creek was doing what creeks do in late summer, which is run low and patient and unremarkable. She had not arrived here by any graceful path. She had arrived here through 8 years of forward motion, not always dignified, not always clear-eyed, frequently wrong about the next step while being right about the direction. She had made choices under duress and choices under uncertainty, and choices that cost her in ways she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have prevented. She had been humiliated in public and dismissed in private and cheated of the kind of assumption of goodwill that was given freely to people in different circumstances. None of it had been fair. She had long since stopped expecting fair, which was not the same as accepting unfair. Accepting unfair was a stillness. What she had instead was a kind of forward weight, the perpetual slight lean into the next thing, the next problem, the next document that needed to be read correctly, The next woman who arrived at the end of a road with one bag and needed not charity but transaction. She had built a workroom. She had cleared her father's name. She had written a marriage contract that protected what she'd earned. She had taught 4 women to read the parts of documents that were designed not to be read. She had found in a man she'd spent months preparing to distrust, someone who'd understood from the beginning that helping her and owning her were irreconcilable operations. She had not been rescued. She wanted to be precise about that, because it mattered. The distinction between being helped and being rescued was the whole of her life's argument. She had been helped by Dell's honesty, by Francis Aldis's expertise, by Warren Gatch's skill, by Silas's resources, and his willingness to deploy them in service of her purposes rather than his own. Help was a transaction between people who each brought something. Rescue was a transaction where one person had nothing, and the other had everything. She had never been nothing. Not in the Founders Festival dirt, not in the years before, not now. The woman who had been dismissed by this town had built something inside it. The name above the door was hers. The women she worked beside were building things too. Violet Cross would come in the morning, and she would either have what she'd described or she wouldn't. And if she did, she would have somewhere to bring it that would treat it with the weight it deserved. That was the thing. That was the whole of it, stripped to its function. She had built a place where things were treated with the weight they deserved. Work, names, contracts, people. It was not finished. It would not be finished. The railroad would file its amended easement claim, and they would challenge it again. The workroom would grow or have a difficult season, or both at once. Catherine Bell would have days where the understanding of what had been taken from her came back fresh, and Eliza would be there to hand her the next document and say, quietly, without making it into something larger than it needed to be, "This is how you read this. This is where the trap is. This is how you don't walk into it again." She sat with Silas in the dark and felt all of it, the weight of what was done and the weight of what was still ahead, and it was not comfortable or clean or complete. It was just real, the realest thing she'd ever made. A hawk moved somewhere overhead, invisible in the dark, but audible the cut of air that a large bird makes when it is going somewhere with intention. She listened to it until it was gone. Then she went inside because there was work in the morning, and she had always known how to meet it.